Ladies and gentlemen, the PlayStation 5 Pro has had no shortage of rumours circulating online, both from myself as well as many other sources, and it's almost certain at this point that Sony have been working on some type of upgraded hardware, which would offer a significant boost in performance over the vanilla console. In this video then, I wanted to put out a shorter piece of content focusing on some really big updates that I've received regarding the CPU as well as the GPU. Some of this information may come as slightly disappointing, particularly with the CPU, which we're going to get into in just a moment, but the GPU has some very good news indeed. And, well, I also want to, at the end of the video, kind of just give my overall thoughts so far on the system. Let's just get right into this, shall we? So let's start things out with the bad news. The CPU still seems to be based around Zen 2. It still has 8 cores, 16 threads, the same as the base model system. Clock frequencies though will be higher, around 4 GHz, but this has not been locked in yet. Clocks don't get fully decided until close to the console's launch. For example, Microsoft cranked the Xbox One's CPU and GPU clocks up just close to the launch of the system, so this can definitely change. But this is also very different to what I reported earlier. My earlier leaks seemed to indicate that Viola, which is the code name for the APU inside the system, was actually featuring Zen 4. So, what happened? Well, honestly, I don't fully know the story. It's possible that my earlier information was wrong, or this latest update of Zen 2 is wrong. But I've also heard from multiple people that there were competing designs within Sony regarding the final specifications of the machine. What I can say is that this current design, from what I'm being told from a couple of sources, seems to have been the design that they are going with. It's been taped out and is furthest along in development. My guess is that what happened basically is the Zen 4 stuff was a competing design that they were playing around with internally, but they decided, you know what, it's just not worth it. The CPU is not enough of a limiting factor, so we're instead just going to go with Zen 2. Just raising the clock frequency and doing a few other tweaks is probably going to be enough for them to hit the frame rates and so on they need in the majority of titles. The Xbox as well as the PS5 really are limited by the GPU in this generation anyway, especially with things like ray tracing enabled. I also think that Sony are not going to revert some of the custom work they did, for example cutting the FP units for AVX instructions in the PS5 Pro. I think they're probably going to keep that. I haven't been told specifically the change that they have made. There were also a bunch of stuff they did for caches to reduce like the latency and stuff. What else they've changed, I honestly do not know. Again, all I have is a very basic information. The IP of the CPU, the basic thread count, core count, as well as the clock frequency target. But let's move on to the GPU, because things get much more interesting here. Tom Henderson and myself both stated that the PS5 Pro seemed to have 30 workgroup processors or 60 compute units. What wasn't clear at the time is whether this was the total number that was active on the die or whether that was inactive. So in other words, was it something like 30 was the total number that was on the actual APU, but let's say 27 was enabled, or was it 30 that was actually enabled? Now, in my previous video, I had calculated different performance numbers based upon different clock frequency and different number of workgroup processors that were enabled. The good news is, though, it seems that the number of 30 is the actual enabled number, and 32 is the total on the chip. This is quite interesting. This also seems to be a slight difference in some of the other specifications, because what I'd basically been told previously is that it was very similar in the general layout of the shaders and shader arrays to N32. So we have 3 shader engines and 6 arrays. This would be one of the reasons that I said 27 was the most likely. You could basically just disable one workgroup processor from each of the shader engines, but this just does not seem to be true based upon what I'm hearing now. 2 shader engines with 16 workgroup processors each, giving a total of 32. 2 of these are disabled, 1 each SE, so this of course leaves a grand total of 30. You can kind of get more information as well on Kepler L2's Twitter, as he's giving a little bit of a hint to the layout of the PS5 Pro specifications. And I do think this is right. I've received a number of people now that have told me that this information does seem to be correct. I'm also told that there's a significant jump in the GPU performance, thanks to clock frequencies as well. But again, this is going to depend on things like yields, heat, and power consumption. The numbers internally tested are between 2500 and 2800 megahertz. However, this leads us to yet another complexity of the PS5 Pro. You can't just do a exact T-flop to T-flop comparison between, let's say, the PS5 and the PS5 Pro. Basically, the GPU IP seems to have been receiving some significant updates, and it seems to be RDNA 3.5 according to multiple sources. This is exactly the same GPU IP as AMD are using for some of their APUs, for example, Strix Point and Sarlag. I've leaked the specifications of these AMD APUs a million times. They're going to launch next year. There are some differences. Sony are using some custom elements, of course, and with, for example, Strix Point, it's based on Zen 5 for its CPU, whereas again, the PS5 Pro just seems to be using Zen 2. But we'll get more into the custom stuff in just a second. But what this really means is RDNA 3 has dual issue instructions on its FP32 units. It's complicated, and I've broken this down to dedicated PC RDNA 3 videos previously, or you can just do a Google. But what this basically means is it doubles FP32 performance. So in the case of, for example, a 20 T-flop GPU, it can kind of be 40, but it's not applicable for all instructions, and it doesn't necessarily affect performance, at least on PC games. This is not necessarily, therefore, saying the PS5 Pro is even faster because of this, because we don't exactly know how it's incorporated, or whether the games on the PS5 Pro would even benefit from this. Either way, for the non-double pumped numbers, we're looking at 30 workgroup processors at 2500 MHz being around 19.2 T-flops, and 21.5 T-flops if we are running at 2800 MHz. Again, the clock frequency of the GPU could fall anywhere, so these are just example numbers only based upon the clock frequencies that I was told. And as for that IP, so it becomes very complicated. I'm told RDNA 4 is probably not the ray tracing technology inside the PS5 Pro. It seems to be either some type of custom design from Sony or RDNA 3 point whatever. However, it's very difficult to know about this because I've received so much conflicting information regarding the IP of the GPU's RT units. I also have talked a lot about RDNA 4 on the desktop anyway. AMD have also done their own patents for ray tracing, which do seem to be based upon RDNA 4. There are a number of differences, but the TLDR with the RDNA 4 implementation of ray tracing is basically, it's more NVIDIA-like. So rather than with the RDNA 2, for example, where it's running BVH calculations, which is basically it figuring out the structure of the scene, essentially it's done via compute command, so it's run on the shaders of the GPU. However, with NVIDIA, you actually have essentially a dedicated traversal piece of hardware on the GPU, and AMD seems to have incorporated that with RDNA 4. From what I understand, this is possibly not inside the PS5 Pro, but honestly, I've received so much conflicting information. Either way, RDNA 4 on the desktop, as I've reported, seems to be canned for the high end. This is not, however, to do with the IPs of the GPU, but basically chip design manufacturing issues. So it seems the high end for AMD is going to be RDNA 5, so they're basically going to skip it, which means that the high end for AMD is going to be, well, probably around 6 quarters, maybe a little bit more delayed. But the low-end RDNA 4 chips for the PC anyway are going to be N43 and 44, and they're still going to launch as planned. Again, I've released videos about that and gone really in-depth into it, so I'm not going to kind of go over the point too much here. But I am told that there is likely still RDNA 2 elements within the PS5 Pro, probably because of backwards compatibility. But it doesn't really mean much, because one, we do not know what they are, Sony and Microsoft do custom work all of the time, and just saying, you know, RDNA 2 or RDNA 3, it just doesn't mean anything. It's really down to so many different elements of the GPU. It's like custom GPUs are just so complicated at the best of times. For example, RDNA 3.5, the rumor is that it has a number of enhancements of RDNA 4 already for the desktop. And again, I've gone into some of what those are, but there are some changes to, for example, Seilu, as well as the geometry engine. But how much that even affects the PS5, since, for example, Sony have their own bespoke geometry engine, it's very difficult to know. What about the ROP count? Well, again, this is where things get quite complicated. I'd been told 96 previously, but this information is possibly off. The possible configurations are 64, 96 and 128. The thing with ROPs is they are basically for pixel fill rate. Now this is really complicated stuff and I'm going to vastly simplify this, but essentially more of them is great when it comes to on-screen effects with higher resolutions. Yeah, sure, you can improve the amount of T-flops on a GPU and better ray tracing performance is great and all, but you still need to actually be able to draw that stuff, put it onto the screen. Higher clock frequency of the GPU would help here, as ROPs are basically multiplied by the clock frequency, or rather ROP fill rate is multiplied by the number of ROPs and the clock frequency, as I showed with my RTX 3080 in the last video. 64 ROPs are present on the PS5 base model, so it wouldn't surprise me if they have increased this number, but I can't get anything solid. What about the memory? Well, 16GB seems to be what's inside the machine. I've been told this by multiple people at this point. 18 Gbps, which is what Tom Henderson leaked, and also it would provide a lot of additional memory bandwidth, but there also seems to be some DDR5 memory in there, which is for holding OS stuff. Sony did the same for the PS4 Pro. They added some DDR3 memory, again for OS stuff. Unfortunately, I can't get any confirmation of that. I've even been told different numbers, like 2 and 4GB. So I'm just adding it here for your FYI, but I'm honestly not certain about it. I've also been told that there are tweaks and improvements to the SSD, but it's so wishy-washy as a statement. What is that? What is an improvement? Is it larger? Is it just faster? If so, we're talking about bandwidth. If so, how much more? And so on and so on. I was also told early on that there were enhancements to the PS5 Pro's Tempest engine, which is of course for audio and other things. The information I'd received then is it was double in size, but has this occurred or not? I don't know. As with any of these specifications and leaks, anything can change, including whether the actual console does launch or doesn't. Without any question, it's going to be nothing short of fascinating if and when Sony do release the PlayStation 5 Pro. At the end of the day, even if the machine has come very far along in development, Sony could choose to cancel it. I do think at this point it's more likely that it will get released, and quite honestly I would be very interested to see what it's actually capable of. Roughly speaking, it's going to be capable in GPU performance anyway as high to mid-range PC. But of course it is a custom design when it comes to the GPU, I mean. But it is of course a custom design, which makes exact comparisons a little more tricky. I will also be super curious to see what the pricing decisions are from Sony with the PS5 Pro, because some of the earlier information that I was receiving is that the machine was going to be pretty expensive. But if there were multiple designs being considered, and again, I think it's probably likely that there were, maybe this is like a cost-reduced variant of the design. Ultimately, it's not just a collection of specifications. It's very easy just to look at, just for example, the number of CPU cores or the amount of T-flops, but what you always have to do as well is say to yourself, from the perspective of a developer, and obviously if you're not a games developer, which I'm not exactly, but I do speak to, them, you have to say, well, what does this actually enable? Just for example, they could have added, let's say 2 times the amount of CPU cores, but does it actually benefit the PlayStation 5 Pro and actually the developers? Because then it's extra work for the developers to actually use the, extra cores. They have to do a lot more optimization. Obviously those cores aren't available on the base machine, and it just becomes a lot trickier. Whereas on the other hand, something like a GPU, I am vastly simplifying here, but it's a lot easier to kind of scale things up and around GPU performance. You can simply, for example, dial up resolution, adjust texture quality, adjust ray tracing, and so on and so on. I don't think Microsoft are going to have a Pro console, as I've said a couple of times now, simply because Phil Spencer himself has said that it's just not something that they've done. The console has just not been worked on. And I do think it's possible that Microsoft did at the very least consider a Pro console, perhaps very early on. But at this point, I think it's much more likely than not, which means ultimately Sony kind of just has this next couple of years to release the PS5 Pro and then just kind of, well, let it sail on. I'm going to be very interested to see how all of this stuff shapes up. With that said, guys, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you have, well, leave a like and all of that stuff and let me know your thoughts and opinions on it. By the way, I'm sorry for being a little sweaty. It is actually quite warm at the moment in the UK, which is kind of weird. We've gone from just constant rain to back to merciless humidity. With that said, bye for now.